Okay, hi everyone. This is the last of our three videos on the topic covering the period after the Second World War. One of those videos that you already saw covered the Bretton Woods economic system, and the other one in the Cold War. In terms of the period they were covering, they basically were the same. That is roughly the 3 decades or so after the Second World War, although technically the Cold War goes a little bit longer than that. We really didn't get into the period of the very end stages of the Cold War. So we're looking at the same period in these two videos, which are the last of the fourth floor, but from slightly different though overlapping angles. One looking mostly at this kind of capitalist economic system of, if you like, managed liberalism, which we call the Bretton Woods system, which was implemented after the Second World War, and the other, a more kind of ideologically focused video on the Cold War and the division of the world essentially into two main spheres of power, one communist, one capitalist. So what I'm going to do in this video is go over the other themes, concluding with these last two videos that you had in the fourth floor in anticipation of the test, which you'll be taking Tuesday afternoon. And I presume you're watching this on Tuesday, so that would be today. Okay, so this is the longest set of videos and readings that we have during the semester. The others cover no more than 5 videos, whereas here you can see from this map that we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 videos associated with the fourth floor. So those two first videos that we had covered the so-called Second Iron Age, which is really the second wave of the Industrial Revolution, and globalization, when that basic industrial revolution not only spread to other places outside England and other industries outside of, say, textiles, but also to iron and steel, and then created this process of globalization when this production needed markets and needed inputs in the form of raw materials. And this created the great wave of 19th century globalization we see kicking off really during the middle of that century. But although this wave of globalization was really backed by liberal ideology, the idea that, for instance, trade should be open and free, things didn't actually work out that way all the time. Often trade wasn't so free, as we've seen in the case, for instance, of the Opium Wars with China. And moreover, the very expansion of the liberal system eventually caused instability and a great global financial crisis, really the first truly global financial crisis in 1873. And a reaction of that was imperialism, because when international markets failed, one way in which countries could secure necessary markets and resources was by simply taking territory. And this tendency increased after the global financial crisis of 1873. This caused an expansion of imperialism, which was one of the things that led to World War I, because as tensions built up between these different European powers, Britain, France, Russia, and of course this new country of Germany, all competing for territories and resources, and all the while other empires, especially that of the Ottoman Empire, in decline, and countries sort of fighting over those territories. This eventually exploded into World War I. After World War I, of course, there was a peace, but that peace only lasted for about 2 decades before the world experienced an even worse world war, the worst war that has ever happened, namely World War II. So during that interwar period, we saw there was an attempt to reconstruct European economies. We saw that there was an attempt to create an international institution called the League of Nations, which would guarantee peace, but none of this was successful in the long term, not least because this brief period of liberal reconstruction was followed by a Great Depression, which helped give rise to nationalist movements, including, of course, most notoriously the Nazis, which gave rise in turn to World War II. Finally, after World War II, there was a new attempt to reconstruct Europe and the rest of the world that had been devastated by World War II. And this attempt was more successful. At least we didn't end up having World War III, at least we haven't had it yet. And so you can say that the combined Bretton Woods system, which was a system of managed capitalism for at least the Western countries in the world, combined with the Cold War, which was what is sometimes called a bipolar system, where the world was essentially divided into these two main spheres of influence, one on the Soviet side and one on the US side, although there were others. For instance, China was communist, but not really aligned with the Soviets. And you had all other parts of the world, like most of Africa, which were not aligned, either of these two spheres of influence. But basically, you had this, what is sometimes called bipolar system. Although that this seemed very tense and always threatened to spill over into a world war, of course it didn't. And some people look back on the Cold War, remembering it as a time of surprising stability, because actually this competition between these two main powers, the United States and the Soviet Union, kind of created a kind of stability in the system where neither one could gain too much control. Okay, so let's talk in a little bit more detail about the main themes from the fourth floor, and we'll kind of go video by video of things that you should bear in mind. That's not to say that the things that you see here are all going to be represented on your test, but of course some of them will. And so if you pay close attention to this video, hopefully this should stand you in good stead for the test. Okay, so from that first video we saw on the Second Iron Age, you should know that this was characterized from the middle of the 19th century by a new wave of industrialization based on iron and steel production. That this was also associated with key expansions of communications and transport technologies, of which you had things like, for instance, the emergence of telegraphs and of course steamships. But the most important of these new transport technologies was the railroad, which was kind of a great symbol of the age. And that another key feature of this period was that you saw the Industrial Revolution spread beyond its roots in England to other parts of Northern Europe and to North America, namely especially the United States, which became another industrial nation from the middle of the 19th century. Okay, looking at the next of these videos we had in that first day covering the fourth floor, globalization and the Great Divergence, as I mentioned previously, is really an outgrowth of the Industrial Revolution. So when the Industrial Revolution began to spread, this caused a couple of things. One, it fed this wave of globalization. So if we understand globalization as, among other things, this phenomenon whereby capitalism is expanding and seeking markets and seeking raw materials to feed industries, this is one of the ways in which globalization worked. So as industrial production ramped up, rapidly, for instance, local markets could be saturated, seeking, therefore, to expand into other markets. And these new industries that were being created often required input, so in the form of raw materials, like, say, rubber, which also led to a kind of globalization in the expansion seeking resources. So globalization in the 19th century was essentially an outgrowth of this expanding industrial revolution. And so we see a vast expansion of international trade, especially from around 1850, which caused a boom unlike anything that had been seen before in terms of expansion of global trade. And this was also accompanied by a British-driven push for free trade, that is the liberalization, opening up of markets, although again, that wasn't applied consistently. The British, for instance, basically forced open the Indian market, which was their colony. So this was nothing like free trade. We've seen, for instance, that the Opium Wars were a case of the British basically forcing Chinese to take their opium produced in India. This was when the Chinese were forced to sign the Treaty of Nanjing, called a free trade treaty, but it wasn't free. In fact, it's sometimes called gunboat diplomacy because the Chinese were forced to accept these drugs and forced to sign this accompanying treaty. But the other side of this coin of globalization in the mid-19th century is that we also see this process sometimes called the Great Divergence. The Great Divergence implies this change in the world whereby previous to the Industrial Revolution, that is, if you take a baseline year when the Industrial Revolution was just getting going around 1800, a really rich country would be about twice as rich as a really poor country. But fast forward 200 years later to around the beginning of the 21st century, and that gap was about 20 to 1 between a rich and a poor country, or 80 to 1 in the most extreme cases. So this was basically caused by this incredible productivity boom of the Industrial Revolution being shared among some countries, namely Western Europe, North America, a little bit later Japan, etc., but other countries not participating in this. And so this huge economic growth that was made possible by industrialization caused a kind of takeoff in some and a stagnation in others, or as this next bullet point regarding deindustrialization implies, even a decline in absolute production. As happened in Asia, countries like China and India had been the leading manufacturing countries in the world before the Industrial Revolution, and now their production was decimated and they became instead markets for Western goods. So you see this kind of flip of the cycle of world trade, whereas before in this class we've seen that Asia produced stuff that Europeans wanted. Now from the 19th century we see that polarity reversed, and it's Europeans producing stuff for Asian markets. We're not such big producers anymore, but become markets. Same thing happened in Latin America after these countries became independent. They opened up to foreign trade and received a huge influx of manufactured goods, especially from Britain. But unfortunately, that saw their local production decline. So they also experienced deindustrialization. So accordingly, we see the emergence of a large global wealth gap. And so this is another consequence of globalization. Now, finally, we should also mention about globalization. We have this article from Jan de Vries, where he seeks to distinguish between hard and soft globalization. So according to Jan de Vries, the concept of soft globalization is sort of what we saw in the world before we looked at the expansion of the Industrial Revolution. That is, for instance, the creation of trading networks linking up via various oceans, the Indian Ocean, the Pacific Ocean, trade in mostly luxury goods. So for instance, the Manila Galleon trade, which brought back luxury goods like silk and porcelain from China, is an example of soft globalization. Hard globalization, on the other hand, implies when you have really the measurable integration of economies and very large scale trade that is causing, for instance, prices to drop substantially as a result of falling transaction costs and advancements in technologies facilitating trade. And this is a process you really see getting going from the 1820s or 1830s. So some economists who think, okay, what was happening before the Industrial Revolution doesn't really count because it wasn't in very big volumes. It was still very expensive and mostly, though not exclusively, in luxury goods. Those people are people who favor this definition of hard globalization because they would say, okay, it's only from around the 1820s or 30s that you can see prices really going down, volumes really going up, and global trade starting to happen on something like a modern scale. On the other hand, if you say, no, what's really important is to see that globalization was already happening from the 15th, 16th century at least, in the form of linking up the oceans and moving goods across the globe, albeit not in such great numbers, those people would favor a kind of definition of globalization that we would call soft globalization. That is to say, it doesn't mean that hard or soft globalization is somehow the true globalization. It's just that what you think globalization is primarily will also define whether you favor this hard or soft definition and accordingly when you think globalization started. Okay, going to the next video, 19th century imperialism, we can see that after the 1873 financial crisis, when there was this push toward, on the one hand, more protectionism, reacting against the failure of liberal markets, there was also a push toward more imperial occupation. So we see, for instance, the scramble for Africa, where basically in a matter of a couple of short years, almost all of Africa was carved up among half a dozen or so European empires. And we can see also in the 19th century, especially in the latter third of the 19th century, the emergence of new empires in the form of the US, Germany, and Japan. The US had not liked to think of itself as an empire before, though some would say that the expansion of its own borders to the west, for instance, in fighting the Mexican War at the middle of the 19th century, was a kind of imperial activity. Nonetheless, it was not until the really end of the 19th century that the US started taking territory outside of its internal borders, for instance, with the Spanish-American War, which got them Spain, the Philippines, not Spain, but I should say Cuba, the Philippines, and Puerto Rico. And in addition to actually formally taking territories, US companies increasingly had an interest in the US government taking a more heavy-handed role in occupying territories in the Caribbean basin, basically to make sure that business interests were backed up. So you see, for instance, the US Marines occupying various Central American countries like Nicaragua at various moments, or even parts of Mexico, when companies like oil companies or United Fruit Company complained that somehow their assets were being threatened. And this process of US being more interventionist in the Caribbean basin after the Spanish-American War in 1898 is called the Banana Wars. And this lasted basically for the first 3 decades of the 20th century. It's also characterized by, for instance, the US building of the Panama Canal, which of course was in territory of this new country called Panama, which the US basically helped shepherd into existence, supporting the Panamanian independence movement, taking it away from Colombia when the Colombian Senate refused to ratify the US taking that canal zone. The US basically just helped make a new country, which in turn gave it the Panama Canal Zone. Other ways in which this period of the Banana Wars touched upon Colombia was the so-called Masacre de los Bananeros, when the US didn't actually formally invade Colombia, but basically threatened to do so unless Colombia sorted out this problem, whereby United Fruit Company workers near Santa Marta were striking, demanding things like higher wages, regular working hours, freedom from debt servitude, etc. And the Colombian army basically shot several, perhaps even several hundred of these people in response to US pressure. So along with the US expansion, we see Germany, which was a new country, only came officially on the map as an established state in 1871, but was rapidly industrializing, was indeed a major industrial power, second only to the United States by 1900, but didn't really have the empire to go with it, notwithstanding taking some territories, for instance, in Africa with the Scramble for Africa, but was a very ambitious country. And so we can see that some of this tension, which eventually erupted in World War I, was also a reflection of Germany's ambition to have an empire that matched its industrial power, because its empire, of course, as a newcomer to the scene as a state, couldn't match that of Britain or France. Finally, Japan, after the Meiji Restoration in 1868, was also one of these sort of ambitious and industrializing countries and wanted an empire to go along with it. And so increasingly started building up an empire in Asia, including eventually occupying parts of China, islands throughout the Pacific, and even Korea. So we see this expansion of these empires in the 19th century, and along with it, as mentioned, the decay of the Ottoman Empire, which would increasingly cause tensions inside of Europe, which would lead to World War I. So the Balkan regions were territories formerly occupied by the Ottoman Empire, though in the years before World War I broke out, had no longer been Ottoman territories for some time. But generally speaking, the Ottoman Empire was in decay, and countries like Germany were seeking to take advantage of that, for instance, signing concessions for the most important commodity located within the Ottoman Empire, namely oil. This created concerns on the part of the British and fed this rivalry between the Germans. Anglo, in this case, means English, of course. So Anglo-German rivalry, this emerging rivalry in Europe between Germany and the British, played out in part in Ottoman territory, which was again fed by the stirrings of the petroleum economy, demand for petroleum, and concerns about gaining concessions of Middle Eastern oil in Ottoman territory. And all this finally erupted into World War I, which was what could have been the Third Balkan War, but then spilled over into Western Europe when Germany used the emergence of this war in the Balkans to invade France. Then, of course, Russia became involved in the war. Germany, in turn, expanded the war to the east. And you get fairly rapidly this world war, which has also been called a total war in the sense that it not only was so much bigger than any war that had happened, partly because it involved industrial countries who could produce weaponry and material on a much larger scale, but was also involving these empires. So Britain, for instance, called upon its entire empire to fight this war, and therefore was total in that sense, involving a global empire, but also because it involved whole economies and people from all walks of life, not just young men being conscripted as soldiers, but for instance, women going to work in factories producing munitions, people who were beyond military age, men and women serving in various capacities, including in factories or defending the home front. And of course, civilians were affected when cities were bombed, for instance. So this was a total war in the sense that it involved whole economies and people from all walks of life, civilians involved in these wars, not just soldiers themselves. Okay, now we can move on to the concept of the 20 Years Crisis after that war ended. We see that the war was something unprecedented in terms of its violence. And so there was this idea that they should try to make sure they created a lasting peace. And US President Wilson's plan for that lasting peace was enumerated in his so-called 14 points, which included various provisions for instance, national self-determination, free trade, freedom of the seas, an end to secret treaties, so-called open covenants of peace were supposed to be created. And this included, of course, also a provision for the creation of a multinational political organization, which of course was created and called the League of Nations. Of course, we know that Wilson's 14 points weren't very successful. And in fact, no attempt at peace after World War I was successful in the sense that another world war happened only 2 decades later. And there were various reasons for the failure of the post-war peace. One thing that happened after World War I was the German hyperinflation, when Germany effectively allowed its currency to inflate so that it wouldn't be worth as much against the French franc and British pound, so that the money that it had to pay back in reparations when converted into those currencies would mean that effectively Germany had to pay less money, because if it had to pay 10 marks and all of a sudden a mark was worth half what it had been worth previously against, say, the French franc, that would be effectively a form of backdoor default. But this got out of control. People in Germany lost faith in the currency. Germany entered an inflationary spiral. And the upshot of this was that finally they basically had to tear up their old system, create a new currency, and wipe all the debt associated with the old central bank and its currency off the books, meaning that many middle-class and working-class Germans who had bought war bonds during World War I saw those bonds become worthless. This was a patriotic duty that Germans had indulged in during the First World War, buying these bonds to help fund the war effort. But it was also a key part of their savings. And when the value of these bonds was basically ripped up, many middle-class Germans were left without savings. So although the economy in the middle and late 1920s seemed to stabilize in Germany and elsewhere, it left many Germans vulnerable. And when at the end of the 1920s, then the economy did fully collapse in the Great Depression, many Germans who saw themselves unemployed, in fact, unemployment in Germany with the Great Depression went up to around 40%, were particularly vulnerable because they had no savings. This in turn fed a rejection of liberal ideology in favor of nationalist ideology, including the Nazis, for instance, who basically said that the Great Depression and the loss of World War I, these things were the fault of some evil group within their midst, namely the Jews and bankers. And many people found this message increasingly appealing when they were unemployed and somehow angry. And this message that it wasn't their fault was therefore appealing. So with high unemployment came a turn to more radical nationalist right-wing messages, especially. And that kind of set the stage for the Second World War, because Hitler increasingly started rearming Germany and created this militarist rhetoric, which of course eventually made the Second World War inevitable. Meanwhile, this international institution, the League of Nations, was never particularly strong and never able to cope with these growing tensions in the world. This was partly because the US, despite the fact that the League of Nations was the brainchild of Woodrow Wilson, never joined the League of Nations. The US never joined, largely because having got into World War I against the wishes of most of the American public. After the war, the American public, and along with it, many US politicians, were determined to keep the United States out of international entanglements. So the US effectively went into a kind of isolationist political stance. And accordingly, the US Senate refused to ratify the US joining the League of Nations. Okay, so after the Great Depression ends or culminates in World War II, we have the fact that it happened somewhat reluctantly because countries like Britain and France, remember, had tried to appease Hitler. For instance, the Munich crises, one of these crises that the League of Nations or these independent countries like Britain or France failed to resolve adequately, happened when the Germans, the Nazis, invaded Czechoslovakia. And instead of starting World War II, the British and the French basically said to Hitler, okay, Hitler, take Czechoslovakia, and if we give you Czechoslovakia, now please play nice. Well, Hitler, of course, basically laughed at them and turned around a year later, invaded Poland. And finally, when Hitler invaded Poland in September of 1939, that was too much. And this did cause World War II. But it caused World War II, at least for the first year or so of World War II, or a little bit less than a year, in what is called the Phony War, because even then, Britain and France were not keen to get involved in another world war. But the Phony War finally ended in the spring of 1940 when Hitler turned around and invaded France. And of course, then things were playing for keeps. So from the spring of 1940, you have the war enter a more serious phase. But it became even more serious in the summer of 1941 when Germany invaded the Soviet Union. Now remember that Germany had signed a non-aggression pact with the Soviets in 1939, but Hitler had effectively always planned to double-cross the Soviets. He just signed this non-aggression pact so that he could get away with invading Poland without upsetting the Soviet Union, then turn around and take France. And then once he had basically Western Europe secured, then he always planned to turn once again to the Soviet Union and invade the Soviet Union, which he did. So the summer of 1941 was fateful in the sense that it brought the Soviet Union into the war, but it was also fateful in the sense that it basically guaranteed that Japan would eventually enter the war too, because the United States imposed an embargo on Japanese oil and also froze Japanese foreign bank accounts, which basically made the Japanese feel they had no choice but to prepare for war against the United States because they couldn't operate their empire without oil and money. So, of course, at the end of 1941, the Japanese launched a sneak attack on the US Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor, hoping to basically knock as much of the US's military power out of the war as quickly as they can and hoping to win quickly because they knew they couldn't win a long war. Of course, in the end, that failed. The US stayed in the war, and bit by bit, the US basically clawed back the Pacific from the Japanese, culminating, of course, with the bombing of Hiroshima that ended the war in August of 1945. But before that happened, we basically have the war's real turning point, which was not D-Day, the invasions of France through Britain by the Americans, Canadians, and British in June of 1944, but Stalingrad, this war that took place earlier when, after the Germans had invaded the Soviet Union, they went deeper and deeper into Russian territory until finally they were stopped at the Volga River by the Red Army in the bloodiest battle that has ever occurred, 1 million casualties or so. And once they were stopped, then finally the Red Army started turning the tide and pushing the Germans back to the west. And there was only one final outcome that was going to occur then. The Red Army was going to keep pushing the Germans back until finally the Red Army arrived at Germany itself, and Germany would end up losing the war. So from the Battle of Stalingrad, which ended in the winter of 1943, basically the final conclusion of the war was clear. Okay, on to the next themes. I won't focus too much on these themes today because you've just seen them in these other videos. But the Bretton Woods Conference was, of course, this conference held in 1944 toward the end of the war, where there was planning for basically rebuilding the liberal capitalist system after the war. And this was, as Anna Maria mentioned, a kind of attempt to create a managed capitalism, whereby the US was at the center of the system with the dollar as the world's reserve currency. Also was attended, of course, by a Marshall Plan for rebuilding Germany, Japan, and other places, including most of Western Europe. So one difference, you could say, between the end of World War I and the end of World War II was this concerted attempt to rehabilitate the losers. And this Bretton Woods system was immensely successful in its first years. It was attended by a post-war industrial boom, a kind of labor management social pact, and a period of unprecedented success in industrial capitalism. However, in the end, there were also tensions in the system. For instance, the monetary system of the Bretton Woods came into existence only fully in 1958, when European economies were finally able to basically link their currency with the dollar, which was itself linked to gold. But almost from the beginning, this system faced problems, because if the US was operating the dollar as the world's reserve currency, wherein most international transactions were denominated in dollars, that meant that countries had to hold dollars. For countries to hold dollars, basically the US had to run trade deficits, because if the US ran trade surpluses, countries would be paying the difference, that is the US exporting more than it imported. That difference would be paid in dollars, and dollars would flow into the United States. Well, for the dollar to function internationally as the world's reserve currency, dollars had to flow out of the United States. So the US had to run trade deficits. However, if those deficits were too big, if too many dollars existed outside of the United States, then this could basically devalue the dollar, put pressure on the value of the dollar. And remember that the dollar's value was denominated officially in gold at $35 per ounce. Well, if the dollar, if there were too many dollars held outside of the US, this could erode the value of the dollar, and in open trading, the relationship between the dollar and gold could decline, which in fact did happen. By the late 50s, early 60s, the value of gold in open trading went up to something like $40 an ounce, and countries like France basically threatened to sell their dollars and buy gold, which could basically upset this whole Bretton Woods monetary system in the first place. So this problem was what is known as Triffin's dilemma. Triffin's dilemma basically says, okay, the US has to run trade deficits because dollars have to leave the United States. However, if those deficits are too big, then this can erode the value of the dollar and undermine the system. So somehow a delicate balance had to be achieved, and this proved to be extremely difficult. Various remedies were tried, like for instance, the London Gold Pool, which was a system whereby various countries basically bought and sold gold and tried to maintain the open market value of gold at something like $35 an ounce. That is in line with the Bretton Woods monetary value of the dollar. But the problem was that the system was structurally difficult to maintain. And so you could say that from its outset almost, the Bretton Woods monetary system was under pressure. There are other ways in which the system came under pressure. For instance, basically a profit squeeze, which had to do with a decline in this post-war boom of industrial production centered around, for instance, petrochemicals and automobiles, which led eventually to inflation, financialization, and other things we'll talk about in more detail when we get to the fifth floor. But for now, we can say that the Bretton Woods system, while it was beautiful, while it lasted, it only lasted maximum around 3 decades before trouble started appearing, and eventually the system collapsed in the early 70s. Okay, so the other side of what was happening in these decades after the Second World War was the Cold War, where you see, as mentioned, the territorial division of Europe into various 2 main spheres of influence, characterized by the USS sphere and NATO, the Soviet sphere and the Warsaw Pact. This spheres of influence being reflected on a global scale as well. The US policy of containment, meaning trying to contain the spread of communism. And of course, this was done partly through trying to make sure places that were already capitalist stayed that way. And although there was no world war, that happened again, no World War III, and this was due partly to nuclear deterrence, that is, both sides knowing they had nuclear weapons and could destroy each other, and this obviously would prevent them possibly from engaging in direct conflict. There were these very nasty proxy wars, like, for instance, the Vietnam War and the Korean War, fought by the US. And in the case of the Korean War, of course, the communist North Koreans and their allies, the Chinese, or the same, of course, happened in the Vietnam War. Finally, and we don't really need to focus on this too much because we didn't focus on it so much in the videos, the Alliance for Progress was a way in which the Cold War took shape in Latin America, wherein after the Cuban Revolution, wherein Cuba went communist, US really did worry about Latin America and other countries becoming communist, including, of course, concerns about Colombia becoming potentially communist, which saw the US, for instance, bring in military advisors to Colombia starting in the early 1960s. Another thing that characterized this period of the Cold War was decolonization, wherein, for instance, the British and the French basically had to divest themselves of their empires. So you get these new countries appearing on the map like British India, turning into these new countries of India itself, along with Pakistan, Sri Lanka, Burma, what is now called Myanmar, and a little bit later, Pakistan itself split into two countries, namely Pakistan and Bangladesh. Other countries appearing on the map, not necessarily through decolonization, but as a consequence of World War II being Israel, partly as a consequence, of course, of the Holocaust, creating a Jewish homeland in the Middle East. Other new countries coming into existence were, for instance, China, which was an old country, but taking a new shape when the Communist Revolution happened in 1949, and the so-called Capitalist Republic of China turned into the People's Republic of China. But also all these countries in Africa experienced decolonization, wherein their former colonial powers like the French and the British or the Portuguese were forced to cede control to new independent states in Africa. And this happened elsewhere in the world as well. So to kind of sum up some of the main themes from the fourth floor, we have the internationalization of the Industrial Revolution in the 19th century, which leads to 19th century globalization, the politics of free-trade, liberalism, that is, being the kind of engine of this spread of globalization, though of course it was applied extremely unevenly, the expansion of steel production and communications and transport technologies characterizing this industrial boom, the second industrial boom of the middle of the 19th century and late 19th century, the Great Divergence happening because some countries industrialized and saw this takeoff in their economies and rapid growth, while other countries stagnated or actually saw a decline. And this also created this world of more extreme haves and have-nots, which we could associate with the third world. And deindustrialization even happening in certain places like Asia and Latin America as an influx of industrial goods decimated local production. Globalization and finance in the first financial global crisis. Basically, you saw an expansion of not just industrial capital, but financial capital, rapid investment in things like railroads all over the world, but eventually this spilling over into a financial crisis in 1873, which led in part to the wave of imperialism you saw thereafter, where countries saw, again, a failure of markets, international markets, and a corresponding desire to secure territories for markets and for, that is, spaces to sell their goods, and especially sources of raw materials. So then we see the World War happening, partly as a consequence of this imperial expansion, and then an attempt to reconstitute after the First World War international liberalism, but that failing most spectacularly in political terms with this liberal international political institution, the League of Nations failing, but also, of course, economic liberalism failing with the Great Depression, a turn toward nationalism, protectionism, which gives rise to the Second World War. And then finally, after the Second World War, of course, you get Cold War decolonization. Okay, so that doesn't necessarily cover every single possible thing from the fourth floor, but it definitely gives you a solid foundation. And if you review these things, you should be in pretty good shape. So with that, we can now conclude this final, or depending on when you're watching it, first or second, of the 3 videos that we've placed for these last weeks, or this last week of the fourth floor, in anticipation of your tests, which depending on when you're watching this, will either be today or tomorrow. It's of course on Tuesday at 5 p.m. As always, the test will start via Interactiva. You have 51 minutes to complete it. That's more time than before, because there are a few more questions before. There are 17 instead of 13 as with the last test. So accordingly, you get more time, again, in keeping with this agreement that we give you 3 full minutes per question, which I should add, just for some of you who are under the misapprehension that in previous semester students had more time, we did check. And for this number of questions last semester, students also had, again, 17 questions and 45 minutes to do them. So you do have some extra time this time. In any case, again, this will be worth 25% of your final grade. So it is the biggest test of the semester. So we hope you all have studied. And in any case, we hope you are all safe and doing okay. And we look forward to seeing you in the Q&As. And with that, we wish you a happy week. One tiny little thing to mention, of course, is what comes on for next class. Next class, we move into the 5th floor. So we're shifting from this period of the Bretton Woods and the Cold War into this age, which you might call neoliberalism. And the shift between the Bretton Woods period and the neoliberal period is characterized by this sort of crisis period of the 1970s. So we have a video about the crisis of the 1970s, plus a video about neoliberalism, which basically kicks off at the beginning of the 1980s or end of the 1970s. And as always, we have a couple of readings to complement the subjects of that video. So once again, we hope you are all well. We wish you all the best of luck in the test, and we will see you soon. All the best.